Let's talk about adrenals, stress regulation, and how that can affect dosha. So, the adrenals produce hormones that regulate stress response. And we see here several of these hormones. And then adrenals also regulate blood pressure. So, we're going to discuss how the adrenals regulate blood pressure in a separate video, but here we're going to focus on stress response. So adrenals produce hormones that help regulate cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, and catecholamines, which include adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these both affect metabolism, inflammation, the immune system, and sex hormones. All right, so we're going to talk about those. Then we'll get in a later video we'll talk about blood pressure. Okay, so cortisol is the primary stress hormone in the body. It triggers a flight or fight mode and activates the sympathetic nervous system. So pitta tends to respond to cortisol by fighting, vata more by flighting, and kapha by doing nothing, right? So doing nothing seems like that would be maladaptive, right? Shouldn't we respond? But very often, as we see when we watch the news, the best thing to do is to just, chill out and wait a little bit and get more information and then take action, right? So these are three strategies. It should be the flight, fight, or do nothing mode, but it's called the flight or fight mode. And so we get to choose how we're going to handle the particular threat. So cortisol also increases blood sugar. That's important because we see cortisol is affecting then metabolism and our weight and our supply of energy. It makes sense, right? If you activate the body, you need to have sugar available so that our cells can use it as they are activated. So cortisol mobilizes glucose stored in the liver and delivers a constant supply of energy for the body to deal with the stressor. But the side effect is weight gain. As you raise blood sugar, you get more weight gain, and also you could trigger insulin resistance too. Just throwing that out there. And your brain uses up a lot of energy, and as your brain's on high alert, it's going to start using up some of that blood sugar. Your muscles will use it too. Cortisol sharpens your senses and increases your strength. Cortisol is a steroidal hormone, so it suppresses inflammation. And it regulates, so in addition to regulating metabolism and blood sugar levels, as we mentioned above, cortisol can also control salt and water balance and also supports a developing fetus. So mainly, though, we're looking at these features right now, the stress, inflammation, metabolism, and blood sugar levels. But also note that it's going to affect blood pressure. Cortisol curbs non-essential functions like digestion, right? We don't want to be wasting our energy on digesting our last meal when there's a bear chasing you. All right, now obviously if a bear's chasing you, you're going to get an adrenaline rush. It's not just going to be cortisol, the long-term stress hormone, but it's going to be the short-term stress hormone, adrenaline. Cortisol has a bad reputation in medicine, just like stress has a bad reputation, but they're essential, right? It's essential that you have a stress response and that you're motivated to take action and fix the problem, right? So cortisol affects almost every tissue of the body, affects your metabolism, and it's essential for your survival. You want a balanced motivation, not too high, not too low, right? We don't want to be so overwhelmed by stress that we can't handle it either. So balance is what's key. If cortisol is too high, you get high blood pressure, weight gain, a flushed face, and osteoporosis. Right? So cortisol ends up being wet, tense and mobile. By wet, I mean that sense of the word moisture that you get in biocharacteristics, medical traditions. TCM is called damp, Greek medicine wet, Ayurveda called oily. And you could see here by the different words that we're not just talking water here, we're talking and sort of anabolic. It might wet is almost a symbol for a symptom for anabolic, moisturizing and building, nourishing. And so high cortisol looks like vata pushing kapha, you might say, right? That this activation is also going to cause weight gain. Too low cortisol, you get weakness, fatigue, low blood pressure, and hypoglycemia. So too low of cortisol and you start to lose weight. So low cortisol, it makes you dry and lax, and high cortisol makes you wet and tense, right? So normally, in the absence of stress, kapha is wet and lax, right? They're just relaxed and moisturized, and vata is dry and tense. But you could see here with these hormones can sort of shift that around. If cortisol drops too low, you get dry and laxity, but high cortisol, you get wet and tense. So too low cortisol looks like low Agni, low Prana. High cortisol looks like vata pushing kapha. I want to mention that sometimes cortisol levels can be fine, but the tissue is more or less sensitive to cortisol. So some people have increased cortisol sensitivity, and that's associated with insulin resistance, right? So if you have high cortisol sensitivity, that means your blood sugar level is usually high, and then eventually your cells resist it, and you get insulin resistance. So we would expect that correlation. I mentioned already that cortisol is long-term stress and adrenaline is acute stress. So if there's a scary bear in your neighborhood, you're going to get cortisol and your body's going to be on high alert. But if the bear's chasing you, you're going to get an adrenaline rush. So unfortunately, sometimes cortisol is released when stress isn't even real, right? Like this, suppose some person, makes starts talking about shark attacks, because it's the middle of summer, people want to go to the beach, and so shark attacks are always, um, a way to get people reading your newspaper when there's nothing else to say, right? So meanwhile, your odds of dying from a shark attack are like a millionth the odds of getting struck by lightning. So why aren't there, struck by lightning news stories? Well, because sharks are a predator and they're scary, right? So even though the odds are really low, or even though stress isn't really affecting the person, minor worries can trigger release of cortisol. So we want to manage that, right? We want to limit the amount of time that we spend thinking unproductively about certain matters. I run a company. There's always 10 problems happening simultaneously at every time. If I was thinking about those and worrying about them all the time, that's just not what a good manager does, right? And we all have to be managers in our life. So, adrenaline rush, you can get adrenaline rush just from getting bad news. Like if you just lost your job, someone comes in and is like, oh, you're fired. You can get an adrenaline rush from that. Your head might be spinning, or you can get a panic attack, even though there's nowhere to run, right? Like, what are you going to do? If you lost your job, you lost your job, right? So sometimes these hormones are released inappropriately. Obviously, our body does the best job it can. But adrenaline puts the body into hyperdrive, your heart thumping, you get blood flow to major muscle groups, your increase in breathing rate, airways start to dilate. So if I get an adrenaline rush and I'm not running from a bear, I always do like some jumping jacks or just shake it out or do something to release that energy. I don't like all that pent up energy going to nothing. So I'll use it to exercise for a few minutes or whatever, and I'll just burn it off. I think that's an adaptive way of handling that adrenaline rush. Okay, so that's the basics on adrenals. Let's look at first adrenal fatigue and um, and adrenal dominance, and then we'll go into straight up adrenal diseases. So first of all, Western medicine says adrenal fatigue and insufficiency doesn't exist. It's either a disease like Addison's disease, or it's nothing. It doesn't exist, right? So naturopaths diagnose adrenal fatigue, but Western doctors don't recognize it. Western medicine says, well, it's super dangerous to call something adrenal fatigue because that might prevent you from finding the real cause. Well, that's true for any misdiagnosis, right? If you misdiagnose, it ends up being an obstacle to finding the true diagnosis, right? Any case, we can pose the question: do adrenal glands get tired and start producing less hormones? Maybe not, but we don't really care about that as much as health and wellness practitioners. What we want to know is there an observable set of symptoms that if we supply an adrenal tonic that improves production of cortisol, do we see a good clinical result? So maybe the cortisol levels are the same, but the body's not responding to the cortisol, or who knows what, right? We don't always need to know the mechanism in health and wellness. You don't need to know the mechanism in Western medicine either. What we need to know is, does the treatment work, right? Functionally, it could be the same. In any case, if the adaptogen and adrenal tonic works, great. And then the diagnosis is useful. Hopefully someday we'll resolve that issue between Western medicine and health and wellness regarding adrenal fatigue, because adrenal fatigue diagnosis in the health and wellness community has become popular recently. All right, so Stansberry talks about adrenal dominance as similar to a pitta kapha constitution, heat and muscles, the Superman constitution. All right, let's take a look at adrenal. So adrenal dominance is obviously different than Cushing's disease, which is a disorder of too high cortisol. So what exactly happens in adrenal dominance with cortisol? I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows that, but I think these categories are useful nonetheless. Okay, adrenal diseases. Addison's disease is adrenal hypofunction. Your body's not producing enough cortisol and typically too little aldosterone as well. We haven't talked much about aldosterone, but aldosterone is the salt and potassium level regulating hormone. Basically, it means it regulates blood pressure. So Addison's disease is rare, only 1 in 100,000. But we know that people have adrenal imbalances more than 1 in 100,000, right? So we know that there are people who are fatigued and somehow their stress response isn't working well. So that means we need adaptogens. But it's just, again, speaking about this, the Western medicine rejection of that diagnosis, I think that Western medicine instead should say, hey, there's something there. We need to look into it. Maybe it's not a difference in cortisol level, but maybe it's a difference in pituitary sensitivity or who knows what, right? So we are gonna say that people have a maladaptive hypo response to stress greater than 1 in 100,000, and similar with Cushing's disease later on. Do I have prevalence of Cushing's disease here? It doesn't look like it, but we know that it's just not this extremely rare thing. Okay. So even though it's rare, we're going to look at Addison disease because it's going to tell us about the pattern of not enough cortisol. Fatigue, the pattern is fatigue, weight loss, low blood pressure, and body aches. This is what it looks like. It looks like Vata, right? So we see an old lady here with a mustache, the skin turning a little bit darker for their ethnicity, weight loss, postural hypotension, hypoglycemia, looks pretty tired, right? Addison's disease proper, the medical condition is usually caused by autoimmune disease that attacks your adrenals. But adrenal fatigue, this sort of soft diagnosis, this pattern, is something that may not be caused by autoimmune. All right, let's look at Cushing's. This is hyperadrenal. Look at that. That looks more like what dosha? Looks like kapha. We see the flushed cheeks as well. It's a moon face in shape, but flushed cheeks. We see that there's obesity, especially abdominal fat. Stress causes abdominal fat. Osteoporosis is caused by depletion of electrolytes because of cortisol's effect on electrolytes. Looks like there's also changes in hair. So here we had changes in distribution of body hair. Here it says dark facial hair in women. So whether you're high or low, girls, you're getting a mustache. All right, cardiac hypertrophy, muscle wasting in the extremities. Maybe this explains the kapha tapering body part trope. I've never thought about that before, but anyway. And poor wound healing in cortisol. And high cortisol, adrenal hyperfunction. So why does high cortisol create weight gain? So now, this is going to tweak Ayurveda people a little bit, right? Because you're thinking high cortisol, that's vata, right? This person doesn't look like vata, right? Isn't it vata that's tense, anxious, blah, 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 blah? I'm going to say, no, we need to look deeper into this. High cortisol looks more like kapha. And how many kaphas do you know that are super anxious on the inside, but relaxed and overweight on the outside? That's a typical case, right? So cortisol causes hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia leads to weight gain. Cortisol suppresses the thyroid, which causes weight gain. So tension in the nervous system, but low metabolism and high sugar, which causes weight gain. Okay. All right, so let's just go through some causes here by dosha, and then we'll get into herbs, licorice in particular, licorice and adrenal function for students in the herb course. Let's look at adrenal, but before we get there, adrenals and dosha and some sort of pathogenesis. So where could this high cortisol come from? It can come from an overactive amygdala. Maybe a person has PTSD. Maybe the person has just been traumatized by stress. Kapha people tend to be overwhelmed by stress. Maybe because for whatever constitutional reasons, there's sluggishness in the circulation, or who knows what. They can't motivate the energy to actually deal with it. So they, over time, tend to get overwhelmed by stress. I think it could be the thick blood or something. Maybe that thick blood is just hard to move, whereas vata people are just right on it, right away. Like I said, on the outside kapha appears calm, but on the inside, kaphas typically are very anxious. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want their anxiety to be seen, so they appear relaxed. And I also just want to talk about maybe two types of kapha. We have the kapha with high blood pressure. Maybe that's the high cortisol type. And kapha with low blood pressure is hypothyroid only. That's a speculation there. Vata is, they respond to stress by just getting scattered, right? They think about 100 different problems all at the same time. And pitta responds to stress by getting angry. Now, these are all maladaptive. What about just being adaptive, right? Like some people are energized by stress. I can't say whether my response to stress is the best one or not, but if I get really stressed out, I just start to handle problems in a step-by-step fashion, and I don't feel like I am like my head is spinning. Now, that's after 30 years of running my own companies, right? I can remember in my early 20s, whenever there was a problem, I was like, but I'm not like that anymore. I've learned to just get energized by stress instead of getting, destroyed by stress. So for people who are motivated by a cortisol spike to deal with the problems in an adaptive way, stress is healthy for them. Stress is productive for them. But for other people, it can cause quite a problem. Some people don't get cortisol spikes at all because they're when stressed, because their amygdala is not working. And there is a video of and there's lots of studies done on this individual who just doesn't get cortisol spikes at all, and they show him like climbing this rock wall without any ropes or anything, and just this super dangerous environment, and he just is totally calm, right? Is that adaptive or not? Well, it depends on whether he falls off the wall and dies or not. So without the cortisol, you don't perceive as much risk. If you survive that, that could be good because you just maintain this super steady attitude. But if you start jumping out of planes without a parachute, and then it may not be such a great thing. All right, let's. So we've given an overview of the adrenals. I've given an overview of the HPA axis as well. Let's now dive down and apply this to licorice root, and to herbs, so that we can put this knowledge to work for us.